So here I'm at the back door of the St. Thomas School, where Bach was the cantor, the St. Thomas cantor. And I just want to underline just how incredibly busy Bach was in his life. So not only did he have a job as a teacher here, where he actually lived inside these walls, and he had an apartment with children kind of running around all day when they were not at school. It was a boarding school, of course. Not only that, but he had to produce music for the church just around the corner. In fact, not just that church, St. Thomas Church, but 4 churches. And he had to produce a cantata every week for the church. And on top of that, he had to compose music when there was funerals, when there were special festivals, and his output is just astonishing. And I imagine that he probably came, the reason I've chosen the back door here is that I'm sure he must have had on his way to probably to kind of go and find a quiet place to take a little bit of a bit of a breather. Now, when we look at the sheer volume of Bach's output, something became clear in the 1950s, and that is that when Bach was composing, normally we thought that he did over the 27 years that he was here, that he composed his music, kind of regularly over those 27 years. But it turns out actually, when you look at the watermarks inside the manuscripts, that actually he did in the first 3 years almost all the cantatas. Now, I don't know how he slept to do that. This is an astonishing feat of human resilience and human productivity. And if we zoom in more detail on that, then, of course, Bach was having to answer to all kinds of different people as well. He was having to answer to his patrons, the people that gave him the job here, and some of the people who wanted Bach to work here when they signed the contract. Many of the people in the town council that signed that contract wanted Bach to fulfill his role here as the prestigious role of teacher in this school. It was a position with a great kind of lineage, and Bach was here in a way to maintain those traditions. But there were others in Leipzig, because at the time it was an extremely cosmopolitan, advanced cultural city. Other people wanted Bach to be more exploratory in a way to justify his position by doing tremendous works of art that would bring glory to the city of Leipzig. So there were conservative forces in the background of Bach's compositions, and there were also kind of cultured voices and pressures in the background of his compositions. And on top of that, he had 20 children, 10 of whom died, didn't reach adulthood. In fact, his wife also died young too. All I want to insist on is the fact that Bach was having to handle a whole set of remarkably intense pressures, work pressures, and yet he still managed to do something extraordinary.
So despite all his misgivings, Bach decided to throw in his lot and to accept the title of Thomas Cantor and director of the city music here in Leipzig. So he signed his contract and he swore fealty on the Holy Bible. From the moment he set foot in Leipzig, Bach found himself caught in the political crossfire between different factions on the city council. Music, since it carried with it an element of cultural prestige, formed a part of those political tensions. On the one hand, on the city council were those loyal to the elector who wanted a modern Kapellmeister, one who could bring real international prestige to the city, and they were Bach's natural allies. But opposed to them were the Estates Party, who wanted a traditional cantor tied into the school system with all its regulations and with all its teaching duties. And that throttled Bach's room for maneuver.
So with all those different pressures in the background and all those different expectations, it's absolutely remarkable that Bach managed to keep his eye on what really was important and keep his eye on the aesthetic beauty that he was after. And he managed to navigate through all of those different pressures and keep his artistic integrity. Not only that, but he produced monumentally beautiful bits of art. And I think the St. John's Passion is a wonderful example of that. If you just take the opening of St. John's Passion, so he composed this for Easter. The Passion is about Jesus' death. It would have been performed at Easter here, and he would have been under pressure to turn out a manuscript for 1 year for that event. And if you listen to the opening bars of it, there's these two things in play. If you listen to the strings at the beginning, these undulating strings, which are kind of rocking backwards and forwards, they represent this kind of, let's say, background disturbance, this dark energy, if you like. And then suddenly you have this luminous entry of the choir saying Lord and the truth. So Bach was able to combine in those two blocks of sound. He was able to capture something that I'm sure he was always wrestling with. Like, how does he manage all these domestic demands on his time, all these kind of grubby human things that are in play all the time? He's always busy, and yet at the same time he is able to just, let's say, speak the truth. In a way, Bach's cheating. He's a genius, and we don't really know where that genius came from. Of course, we just have to accept it. Sort of landed from somewhere. There's not always an explanation for genius. So, in a way, he had a cheat code, Bach, that was downloaded into his brain and his heart, and very few people in the world have ever been gifted with such talents. But if you think about this for the Climate Academy, there's a lesson in here for everybody. And that is that we can all find time to do things of quality. Like, it's not because we're busy, it's not because there's a lot of homework or there's a lot of activities and demands that we can't find time to do things that are special. Secondly, we can always create beauty out of competing expectations. You know, Bach always had to deal with, like I said, these different cultural background noises in his life, people wanting different bits of meat, different things out of Bach. And yet, despite those things being in play, he managed himself to transcend them. And this is the same for the climate crisis. Whenever you give a talk or you write an article in Pillar 2 of the Climate Academy, you can't just unilaterally just slap facts and figures on the table. You always have to deal with different people's expectations, different cultural filters, different psychological things, different social, economic backgrounds. These things are always in play. But that doesn't mean that you can compromise on the truth. That doesn't mean that you have to crop or edit what the truth is in order to fit in with what people are expecting. And this is a beautiful lesson from Bach here, that Bach was able to be a brilliant man and a brilliant artist and communicate deep truths, not despite those things, but through those things. He leans on tradition, he leans on the rules and regulations. He fulfilled all of his, essentially, his domestic obligations, and yet he still did something amazing with music, and that's beautiful.